So the first half of the structure plane is concerned with interaction design. And interaction design, as we said, is concerned with describing possible user behavior and figuring out how the system is going to accommodate and respond to that behavior. Basically, anytime you're working on a digital device of any kind, whether it's a laptop or a phone or a tablet, there's sort of a dance that goes on between the user and the system. And in a good user experience, what happens is that the two are dancing in step, okay? The user and the system are sort of moving along the same path because the user's mental models and expectations are being met by what the system does, how it responds to interaction. So interaction design defines the structure and behavior of interactive systems. The idea is to create a meaningful relationship between the people and the things that they use. Meaningful is the important term there. It has to matter to them. It has to help them do something that they care about. It has to help them accomplish a goal. Okay, it fulfills a need of some sort. Interaction design effectively communicates interactivity, which is, okay, the system is responding to something that I did, and functionality. Okay, what can I do? What's available to me? Its job is to reveal simple workflows and complex workflows, and it needs to make both of those things readily apparent. It has to inform the person as they act about state changes. I did A, B happens. I saved the file. The work that I did has been saved. I don't have to worry about it. You've completed, 6 out of 7 steps. Whatever it is, there's a certain degree of feedback that has to happen to keep the person informed of where they are and what they've done and what they've accomplished. Finally, good interaction design goes a long way in preventing user error. There's an element of forgiveness that happens. If I'm going to do something that's potentially destructive, I expect the system to tell me about it. Are you sure you want to do this? Okay, it makes me confirm potentially destructive actions. You've all seen this. When you open something that you downloaded from the internet, and newer operating systems will warn you and say, hey, this is something you downloaded from the internet. We don't know if we can trust this. Are you sure you want to open it? Knowing that it could contain a virus or it could contain spyware or anything else. So that's how a system prevents user error. You try to, whenever possible, prevent the user from making a mistake. And if they do make a mistake, hopefully the system provides a message that explains what happened, why it happened, and what to do about it, or what to do to keep it from happening again. There are a host of principles that dictate good interaction design, okay, or best practices. But essentially there are 5 we want to focus on. Good interaction design is consistent, it's predictable, it's learnable, it's visible, and it provides feedback. Again, there are any number of things, as you can see on the screen, that sort of dictate what's really solid, really good, really valuable interaction design. But if you do nothing but focus on these 5 things, I can promise you, everything you do is going to be automatically a cut above most of what's out there. And I guarantee you that these 5 principles are the absolute roadmap to making things useful to people, usable, valuable. So you don't have to know everything, but you do absolutely positively have to remember these 5. First and foremost, good interaction design is consistent. What do we mean by consistent? Well, it means that when we create a layout, such as this example of a web page, we create certain conventions. And by doing so, we set expectations in the user's mind of how things work. All right, for example, we have this long purple bar at the very top, which is your main navigation. You have another area in the top right that is secondary navigation. So the things that people care about most are front and center in the big colored nav, and secondary considerations are sort of segregated up in the top right corner. Notice that we also have a search area up there. So we've just set 3 expectations: where your primary actions are, where your secondary actions are, the things that you care about next, and how you can search for content. When we get to an inner page, those things remain consistent. They're in the same place, they're visually represented the same way, and they act exactly the same. Now, at the same time, the content below changes. Why? because we are now on a different page of the site. So if it looked exactly like the home page, we would be sending the signal that you're still where you started from, which could be confusing, right? So it has to change. It does have to become different to represent the context that we're operating in. But the conventions that we set, the expectations for how to move around, how to get to things, have to remain consistent. If you set an example of how links behave on the very first page of the site, you've got to carry that through inside. So the lesson here is don't be different just to be different. Be different when it's better. Be different when it serves a purpose. Be different when it serves to keep the user interested, but doesn't confuse them or frustrate them or scare them in terms of, having the navigation disappear. Well, wait, how do I get back? Those kinds of things. So being different, is part of any interactive experience, but you have to be very careful about what you change and why you change it. Consistency is also a matter of treating components, objects, controls throughout an experience, okay? Again, from the time that we start using an app on the very first screen to the time when we're, sort of knee deep in it, going through experiences, doing things, experiencing things, whatever. Things that have similar behavior should have a similar appearance. Here's a sample set of control patterns for an operating system. Notice that they're sort of grouped in terms of similar appearance and similar function. The things at the top left are all done the same way. Your basic pagination controls, previous page, next page, actions like edit cart, continue to check out. Okay, notice that there are similarities depending on when you experience these things in your journey, as it were. Down at the bottom left, we have a set of conventions for what happens when something's loading. We either see the progress bar for long transactions, or we see these little sort of sprite icons for short transactions. Those are feedback mechanisms. They let us know that the system is doing something. But again, we've set conventions, and they happen the same way every time. In the center, right above the video area, you see an error message. Email address is a required field. What happens when somebody skips a field in the form? Okay, what's the error message look like when it gets popped up? And that visual convention is used every single time there's an error. If you look to the far right, you'll see a series of those messages, each one color-coded in terms of severity. So the point is, we've made a lot of decisions up front as to how we're going to expose things. Components with similar behavior all have a similar appearance. That's a big part of consistency. For the most part, consistency happens in two main ways. First is through behavior. And what I mean by that is that transitions, rollovers, tooltips, things like that should all behave consistently. When I see one instance, every single instance afterward should behave the same way. By doing that, you're leveraging the visitor's prior experience. You showed them how it works, and now it's going to work the same way over and over and over and over again. Remember what I said about intuitive being single trial learning, okay? That's how you create an intuitive app, by leveraging the visitor's prior experience and keeping the behavior consistent. The second way to create consistency in interaction design is in voice. And what we mean by voice is that labels and terms, language, should be the same throughout. Different labels mean different information, and they mean different outcomes. Again, we've set an expectation, and we're clear. This means this other thing means something else. Voice is also made consistent through content and imagery. That means photos, illustrations, icons. All of those things should have a very stable, very consistent style. All right. For instance, if you're using a bunch of icons that have a very specific style visually, or use very representational icons, you don't want to deviate from that. Every other icon that appears should appear to be in the same style. All those things should appear to be related in terms of voice. Consistency in interaction design also comes from design patterns, and by using the same design patterns throughout the experience. A design pattern is essentially a reusable solution to a recurring problem. Drop-down menus, login fields like you see here, those are patterns, okay? Think of that as a pattern. Every time I see a login field that looks like that, username, password, submit, that's a pattern. It gets used everywhere. We don't deviate from that sort of mix because we all know what it is. We accept it. It's consistent with our past experience. If someone invented some sort of new design for a login field that didn't match this, we'd be confused. No matter how obvious the labels were, if it said use this to log in, it wouldn't matter because it's unfamiliar. It doesn't jive with our previous experience. So using similar patterns that people understand and accept goes a long way in creating consistency. So while the content may change, the basic interaction, the processes that we go through stay exactly the same. Doing that makes actions and results consistent and, more importantly, predictable. We know, or we can at least accurately predict what the outcome is going to be because, hey, we've done this before. Design patterns are another way to create consistency, and there are a number of websites that do an amazing job of showcasing all kinds of different design patterns. So if you want to dig into this, go to Google, type in design patterns, and you'll find a wealth of information. Check that stuff out and keep in mind that in a lot of cases, there's just no reason to reinvent the wheel. Good interaction design also means that opportunities to interact are visible. We can see what's possible. We can see what's available to us. Here's a quick example of that. A designer designs a website, and he thinks hard about, okay, there's this main area of content that's going to be most important to people, and then there's these other two options down at the bottom that are secondary. We want to make sure that it's available to people, but it's not as important as this stuff up front. Well, if he's not careful, he designs it in such a way that in most browsers, that bottom content is hidden, and there is no indication that there is anything down there. This has a lot to do with human behavior. We will generally expend the least amount of effort possible in doing just about anything. It's not because there's something wrong with us. It's not because we're lazy. It's because that's the way we're programmed. Okay, that's the way the brain is wired to conserve energy, to conserve effort. So what happens is that we typically will not scroll unless we have a good reason to do so, or unless we have some visual evidence that tells us, hey, there's something down there. All right. If you've ever watched people, I've often seen people in a grocery store staring down at a stack of newspapers that are folded in half. Okay, so they can only see half of the content that's on that front page, but they sort of stare at it and go, do I care? Do I care? Do I care? Do I care? And it's either a yes or a no. They either bend down and pick up and buy the paper, or they just ignore it. But you will not see someone pick up the paper and sort of look through it very carefully and then make a decision to buy. That's conserving energy and effort. This is no different. So discoverability shouldn't involve luck, and it shouldn't involve chance. People should be able to tell at a glance that an opportunity to interact is available. If there are things on the screen, they have to be made visible. One way to do that is to use what we call content hinting. Avoid false bottoms, which is what you see right here. More content and interactivity does exist below the fold, right, or beyond the visible space in this case, but it's hidden. The bottom of the browser window cuts it off nicely and cleanly, so there's no reason for us to think there's anything more down there. A better way to design this would be to do it in such a way where more content exists above the fold. Okay, you see how the bottom photos are cut in half? That's all it takes to give us a signal that there's more down there. Very subtle design decisions make a huge difference in making interactivity visible. There are essentially two ways to interact with digital products. Okay, we've sort of been taught that this is how we do things. We either click or we tap. The thing to know about that is that we will generally attempt interaction with anything that we think could possibly be clickable or touchable. Okay, if we're on a tablet, specifically because there's no hover state in a tablet, there's nothing that sort of responds to our touch, we're tapping all over the place, particularly if we can't tell what's clickable and what's not, okay? So when we see a button that looks like a button, we know to click it. When we see a tab at the very top of a menu, we get it. We say, okay, that's a point of navigation. That's someplace I can go. When we see an underlined link, we get that, right? We know what that is. Different text colors, three-dimensional objects, and icons all invite interaction. Take a look at this example. There are some automatic assumptions based on past behavior that we make when we see something like this. The first is that when I click one of these boxes to the left where the little arrows are, something happens. And that's partly true. What happens is when I touch one of those, I get a new image and some text on the right-hand side. Where it doesn't jive with my current mental model is that when I touch it, I sort of expect to be taken somewhere, and I'm not. The only thing that happens is the picture changes, okay? So the icon and the color set it up as this is a piece of navigation. This is a wayfinding device, and it isn't. So there's a situation where the interactivity is not obvious and it's not really visible. That's what we mean by visibility. It doesn't do what we expect it to do. So you got to be very conscious of the choices you make, along with how people will perceive those things. And in terms of smartphones and tablets, touch and gesture become extremely important. Okay, there are very specific constraints that you have to be aware of when you're designing something that's explicitly meant to be used on a touch screen. And first and foremost, as I said a second ago, there's no hover for touch screens. It's not like hovering your mouse over a navigation item and you get a drop-down menu that says, hey, there's more behind this. You can do something with it, or when a button highlights when you mouse over it. Those indications that something is interactive don't exist. So you have to work a little bit harder to make things obvious, to say you can interact with this object or this control or this element. Another thing that you have to consider on a touch screen is whether a person is left or right-handed. There are a growing number of interfaces that are reversible to consider people who are left-handed, because they don't use everything with their right hand. So it's a matter of proximity, okay? In a lot of cases where all the interactive buttons are on the right side, that doesn't make sense for someone who's left-handed, because what happens is they would have to reach over the interface, which is essentially obstructing their view because the bulk of their hand is going to be in the way. And whether a person is left or right-handed, you don't want to make them reach over the interface and obstruct their view. There are certainly a lot of interfaces that I've used, both on my phone and my tablet, where even though I'm right-handed, I find myself covering 20% of the screen with my hand in order to reach something. Okay, that's bad design. You're not thinking about where the person's hand is on the screen. That's a really, really important consideration, because anything I can't see, I can't interact with. Good interaction design is also learnable. Remember what I said about the word intuitive really meaning single trial learning, okay? What that means is that interaction should be easy to learn and easy to remember. Ideally, you use it once, you learn it very quickly, and you remember it forever. However, that level, that degree of intuitive learning isn't always possible. So you also have to keep it in your mind that with whatever you design, people will use it a few times, they will learn it, but they'll also sort of be hoping that they remember it next time. And that's okay, but you just want to make it as simple as humanly possible, especially across different experiences. Here's an example. This is a screenshot of an Android operating system, mobile operating system. Now, does it remind you of anything? Of course it does. It looks an awful lot like the icon-based screen of the iPhone. And if you look at any mobile smart screen right now, they all pretty much mimic this model that was started by the iPhone. Now, I'm not saying this to be like, Apple is the greatest and we should all buy iPhones. It's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that Apple set the precedent. That device came out first, so people became accustomed to a very specific way of doing things. Icon-based screen, rows and columns of icons. That's expectation. So it would not make sense for Android or any other company, any other operating system, to deviate from that experience, because it's what people recognize. So what they're doing is they're building on what's been done before. They're creating an intuitive learning situation. They're leveraging what people already know. So because it bears repeating, I'm going to say it again. Intuitive really